In this lecture, we're going to look at human creation according to Genesis 1, as well as the portion of the Genesis 1 creation story that runs into the first verses of Genesis 2, the unique seventh day of these days of creation, the Sabbath. And finally, I want to use this lecture to discuss the authorship of Genesis and the other books of the Torah, or Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. Really, to give an update of where scholars are on the question of how these books were composed. Genesis 1 is a creation myth. By myth, I don't mean something false, but a genre that describes in terms of the world that which is beyond the world. Creation myths provide ancient peoples a place to ask philosophical questions like, what is the nature of the universe? What is the nature of humanity? What is humanity's relationship to the natural world and to God? What's the purpose of life? In myth, these questions are addressed not through speculative reasoning, but via narrative. The purpose of a creation myth is not so much to tell Israelites how the world came to be as to tell them what the world is. It's not about what happened at the dawn of time. It's about the nature of the world around you in your lifetime. Look at Genesis 1, starting in verse 26. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." And a wealth of ink has been spilled trying to understand that line. It's repeated in verse 27 when it says, "And God created man in his image, in the image of God he created him." First, I want to talk about what this could possibly mean or what it has meant to thinkers throughout history. We can categorize these interpretations into really 2 kinds. Some people think to be made in the image and likeness of God is a substantial statement. It's about something the human possesses. And then there are others who believe it is functional. It's about something that humans do. So first, the substantial. Maybe people are in the image and likeness of God in that a human possesses reason. God has a rational mind, a human being has a rational mind. Another one could be immortality. God is immortal in the sense that he has always existed and always will exist. A human is immortal only going forward, but given Jewish and Christian belief in eternal life, this is one way that the human is like God. A third sense could be a spiritual nature. In addition to being an animal, a human being is more than animal, like God in being spirit as well as body. Other proposed qualities a human being has in common with God and in contrast to animals include free will and the ability to make moral decisions. Obviously, these are all rather theological interpretations. You would have to admit, if you gave these verses of Genesis to a Martian, the obvious reading is that the God in question must have 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 ears, 1 nose. In other words, the human is in the image of God, while the hawk is not. Not like the Egyptian god Horus. A hawk is in the image of Horus. And this idea of physical appearance, and that is the straightforward meaning of the Hebrew words, would be another substantial interpretation of what it means to be in the image and likeness of God. We should also consider functional interpretations of image and likeness. One of these seems to be required by the context of the verses. Let's read verse 26 now in its entirety. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. He shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, cattle, the whole earth, and the creeping things that creep on earth." When read in context, it seems like image and likeness is quite clearly explained and has to do with dominion. The man is made in the image and likeness of God in that he will rule over the rest of creation. This is a functional interpretation. There's another context down in verse 27. Here we have a snippet of Hebrew poetry. And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Let's have a little explanation of Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry does not involve rhyme, does not involve meter. What I mean by meter is what makes a sonnet poetry or iambic pentameter, things like that. Hebrew poetry doesn't rhyme. Hebrew poetry is characterized by what's called parallelism. Parallelism is basically saying the same thing again, replacing some of the words. If I make a silly example, you'll understand immediately what I'm talking about. My coffee is nearly gone. The morning beverage has been consumed. It's a silly example, but it sounds biblical, doesn't it? Say the same thing twice. The second time, you change a couple of the words. Now, in Genesis 1:27, we have a snippet of this. Instead of 2 lines, we have 3. The first pair. God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. The words are just rearranged. If you numbered the elements, subject, item 1, is God in the first line, and it's he in the second line. The verb is the same, created and created. The object is man in the first line and him in the second line. And then the quality is in the first line, in his image, in the second line, in the image of God. Now we get a third line. Again, the elements have to match 1 to 1. Male and female, he created them. Element 1, the subject, is now he. Element 2, the verb, created. Element 3, the object, is now them. Look what's happened to the last element, the quality. These things have to match. That means the element that in line 1 is in his image, and in line 2 is in the image of God, corresponds to line 3's male and female. This may be difficult to see, but for an Israelite who is used to this poetry, it's inescapable. Image and likeness of God equals male and female. That's a theological statement, and it's really a way of interpreting what image and likeness means. To say image of God equals male and female, again, it's not a straightforward philosophical statement, so we have to unpack it. On the one hand, I take it to mean not so much that females image God just as much as males do, although probably that also, but certainly that to have a full image of God, you need males and females both. I think Israelites are saying in this line, a room full of men does not give you an image of God. A room full of women does not give you an image of God. If you want to know the image of God, you're going to need men and women both. How much more than that we can read into it, I don't know. This is another functional meaning, and it's a functional meaning derived from the context, same as the dominion was. Another way we could look at this would be to unpack the actual Hebrew words. The word that's translated as image is tselem, and the word translated as likeness is demut. Demut is the easier word because it's the word for shadow. You can understand likeness is something that's not entirely like, but it's similar to me. My shadow is like me. If I raise my arm, my shadow raises its arm. My shadow doesn't know the different articles of clothing I'm wearing very well. Demut says a human is a shadow of God. All those other things that a human has, whether they're substantial like reason or whether they're functional like dominion, a human has like God, but not nearly to the extent as God. The other word, tselem, or image, is more tricky. We know what it means. It's the word for an idol. It's what Israelites are not allowed to make. It's what non-Israelites had a statue of in the backs of their temples, tselem of their God. And the thing is, the idol, the statue, is not thought of as a picture of the god, nor as being the god themselves, but the locus where you could encounter and truly worship that god. You can think of an icon. An icon works well because, in fact, the Greek translation made by Jews in Egypt a couple of centuries before Jesus, a translation known as the Septuagint, translated this word tselem as icon. You can think about an icon on your computer's desktop. My desktop has a little blue W icon on it. And the point of the blue W icon is not for me to admire this cool blue W. It's for me to click on it and open a word processor. That's what a tselem is. A worshiper clicks on the tselem and opens her deity. So when Genesis 1 says that humanity is the tselem of God, it's saying if you really want to relate to God, relate to your fellow man. I think this is the basis for Israel being able to say that your relationship to other people is of crucial importance to your relationship to God. Because humans are understood as the place where God can be truly encountered. And this fact explains, too, the commandment not to make an image of this God. You don't make an image of God because He's already made one, and it's the person sitting next to you. Now, this idea of a human person being the tselem of a God is not unique to Israel. In the ancient Near East, the human king, the national ruler, was frequently referred to as the tselem of their God. The king was in the image and likeness of God, and sometimes the king is even called the tselem and the demut. The shock value of Genesis 1 here for a non-Israelite would not be the idea of a human being in the image and likeness of God. The shock value is that it's every human, not just the king. The ditch digger is the tselem of God. A woman is the tselem of God. This is a radical democratization of the concept. The creation story of Genesis 1 runs through the middle of chapter 2, verse 4. Let's keep reading. Heaven and earth were finished, and all their array. On the seventh day, God finished the work that He had been doing, and He ceased on the seventh day from all the work He had done. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because on it He had ceased or rested from all the work of creation that He had done. Which day did God finish His work on creation? Before reading the text closely, nearly everyone will say day 6. But it's quite clear that God finishes on day 7. On the seventh day, God finished. That's verse 2. A number of the early translations of the Bible were uncomfortable with this because isn't the seventh day the day God takes off? And so not only the Septuagint that I described minutes ago, but most ancient versions amended the text to say, on the sixth day God finished. But the original is clearly the seventh. So, if God finished on day 7, what was the work that God did on the seventh day as He finished? Verse 2 says, on the seventh day God finished, quote, the work that He had been doing. And verse 3 refers to all the work of creation that He had been doing. So that defines all the work that He had been doing as creating. That means the work that He was doing on day 7 can only be creating. Now, the only thing created on this day is the day. A creation not in space, but in time. This works very well with an Einsteinian understanding of space-time. For 6 days, God's been creating in 3 dimensions, and now He's going to create in the 4th. We know the day is the thing He created because every other time He's created something, He has declared it either good or very good. And here he declares what he created not good, but holy. It says, he blessed the seventh day and declared it holy. So the day is the creation. And it's the only thing that's not just good, not just very good, but actually holy. So what does it mean to create a unit of time? Judaism comes to think of the Sabbath in Einsteinian terms as a location, only not in space, but in time. So on Friday evening, as the Sabbath begins, you prepare to enter the Sabbath. You put on nice clothes, you take a bath to greet the Sabbath as it arrives. And then you enter into the temple in time, not by moving, except moving in a timeline. You enter it, and 24 hours later, you leave it. You have to realize Genesis was written at a time when Israel had already been practicing the Sabbath. The first Israelites to ever read this passage had been keeping the Sabbath all their lives. This wasn't written to introduce a new holiday. You've been practicing the Sabbath all your life, and for the first time you encounter these verses. You realize that when you have kept the Sabbath, you've been emulating God. You've been imaging God. Which brings me to the last major point I want to discuss. I said these verses, and really all of Genesis 1, was written certainly at a time when Israel had long been keeping the Sabbath and other commandments. How do you know this? And secondly, if you read ahead, you'll see Genesis is about to go through the entire creation all over again. At the beginning of chapter 2, verse 5, there are no animals or humans who are going to get created again and in a completely different order. This time the humans come first, animals second. Why are there two creation stories? The answer to both of these questions, when was Genesis 1 written and why are there two creation stories, depends on understanding the authorship of Genesis. Really, it's a question of the authorship of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible that Judaism calls the Torah, also sometimes called the 5 books of Moses. So doesn't that give it away that Moses is the author of these books? And certainly, Moses wrote the Pentateuch is the traditional answer that many Jews and Christians today, as well as Muslims, would espouse. It's not necessarily the oldest answer. The name Moses does not occur anywhere in the book of Genesis. Our Martian, who picked up the book of Genesis, would never come to the conclusion that Moses wrote it because there's no mention of that name. It seems, in fact, that the idea that Moses wrote the whole Pentateuch, because there are sections in Exodus and Numbers and so on that say, and then Moses wrote this down. But ascribing to Moses not only the stories of his own birth in Exodus, but all the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the creation account in Genesis, that idea seems to be no older than the 1st century BCE. The earliest references we have to it are by the Jewish philosopher Philo and historian Josephus. There's nothing in any part of the Old Testament, prophets, historical books, or Psalms that suggests Moses wrote Genesis or the parts of the rest of the Pentateuch other than where it says Moses wrote. And there's a very good reason for this. The concept of authorship was really a Greek notion. We don't know who wrote most of the literature of the ancient Near East. The Greeks were into authorship. Homer wrote the Odyssey, Plato wrote the Republic. So when Greek thought and Greek rule sweeps the Near East, then the notion of authorship finally is important even to the Jews. On the other hand, the idea that maybe Moses didn't write all of the Pentateuch is not some modern scholar's theory. Already in the 4th century CE, the Christian writer Jerome wrote, "Whether you prefer the view that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch or that Ezra edited it In either case, I make no objection. Jerome is reporting that there are people around him who think Ezra is responsible, at least for the final form of the Pentateuch as we have it. Ezra was a priest and scribe who lived in the Persian period around 400 BCE in Jerusalem. And although Jerome is the clearest to inform us that people were debating what I'll call Mosaic authorship, even in the 300s CE, we get reference to the same debate 100 years earlier than that in 2nd century Christian writings. The point I'm trying to make is that no one was arguing Moses wrote the whole Pentateuch before about 200 BCE, and by 200 CE, people were already questioning this. The modern quest to understand the authorship of the Pentateuch only took off in the 18th century, a task called source criticism. And the results of that quest are traditionally associated with a 19th century German scholar named Julius Wellhausen. Although Wellhausen did not create this theory, he merely brought together work a lot of other people had been doing, but his name is inextricably linked with source criticism because we're still using Wellhausen's terminology, even though that too he borrowed from other people. Source criticism really encompasses two steps. First of all, one would take a text. Exodus 24 is a great one to do because read straightforward, it says, God told Moses to come up the mountain. Moses went up the mountain, and God said, come up the mountain. So Moses went up the mountain. And the problem is Moses ends up going up several times without coming down in between. And he goes up with some people, only when he gets halfway up, he's with others. And then he gets to the top and he's with completely different people. Clearly something is going on here. The first step of source criticism, and you can do this yourself, you don't need to know Hebrew, would be to try to figure out where the breaks are. It's clear it's been cut and pasted together. So can you cut it apart by each trip up the mountain? Then you want lots of other criteria too. You could match the trips up the mountain with the names for the law God gives, or whether you can see God or not. Find 5 or 6 different criteria by which to cut apart a text that has been cut and pasted together. That's step one. And scholars did step one throughout the 1700s and 1800s. And what they began to realize is that, let's say the 3 pieces into which they have cut Exodus 24. The argument is Exodus 24 originally came from 3 different sources. They find characteristics of maybe one of those 3 sources also in 9 or 10 other places in the Pentateuch. In other words, the same name for the law goes with the same understanding of God and so on. So step 2 then is to take the segments in which a given chapter or passage or story has been divided and see if you can find matches to those subordinate pieces other places in the Pentateuch. For example, the last several verses of Exodus 24 look a lot like Genesis chapter 1. They don't look like Genesis chapter 2. Step 2 is not a task of splitting, but of uniting. If you only did step 1, you would break the Pentateuch into a billion sources. By doing step 2 and linking component pieces across the 5 books, that allowed Wellhausen and those around him to say there were 4 sources. The 4-source theory, or the documentary hypothesis, is an answer to the process of source criticism. 4 sources. We don't need to spend a lot of time on them, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Traditionally, Genesis 1, which we've been reading, is called the priestly writer, or simply P. Supposedly P is the latest of all of the sources and comes from around 400. In other words, exactly the time of Ezra. You wonder if Whoever Jerome knew that argued Ezra was responsible for the last editing of the Pentateuch must have been on to the same things that Wellhausen's predecessors were on to. Chapter 2 of Genesis, on the other hand, is supposedly from the oldest of the four sources, the Yahwist, or J. J and not Y for Yahwist, because Wellhausen's writing in German and there's no Y in German. And supposedly the Yahwist or J source was from the 10th century BCE, the time of Solomon. The other two sources fit in between so that the four sources of the Pentateuch were J, E, D, and P. I'm not going to explain E and D. I'm not going to explain this theory much further because, to be honest, in spite of what you might read in Bible footnotes or every Bible as literature textbook, almost no scholar buys this anymore. What 19th century scholars weren't addressing was, what do we mean by sources? For example, are they authors making stuff up, either out of their imaginations or from things they've heard? For Wellhausen, for example, they were certainly authors. An alternative would be to think of them as strictly compilers. In other words, the Yahwist can only write down what he has received, word for word for word. The Yahwist receives something orally, and oral tradition is preserved verbatim. The priestly writer, even knowing he's not writing until the 400s, preserving verbatim what he has heard from other people. That model is the medieval monk or rabbi, copying what they hear or what they read letter by letter. And there were scholars, and still are, who argue that that's what we should understand these ancient figures to be doing. There are other options, however, and in fact now scholars have studied empirically how ancient editing works. Not just in the ancient Near East, but with the early Latin texts and Old Irish texts. And they've suggested that ancient editors were neither writers of fiction nor rote copyists, but historians engaged in research, compositionally interweaving oral and written sources, adding marginal notes and expanding, but in the end, responsible for the wording themselves. And that's important, because if the final editor is even at that stage responsible for the wording themselves, then from a certain perspective, the text is all too unified to do source criticism. The entire text, from a certain perspective, is the work of the last editor. On the other hand, scholars in the last 20 years have also pointed out that the text is really too disparate to do source criticism. In other words, it's one thing to notice that Moses can't go up the mountain if he's already at the top, and that he can't be at the top with 7 people if he went up with 2. A computer could do that kind of thing that we called step 1. But combining the sources from one story with those of another story, what I called step 2, is extremely subjective, based on perceived similarities in the eye of the beholder. We're on thin ice to narrow down the number of sources in the Pentateuch to anywhere close to 4. And these 4 documents make too much unity. So where are scholars now on this? Source criticism is still very useful. Biblical scholars couldn't work without it, couldn't make sense of Exodus 24 without it. But the composition of the Pentateuch was much more complex as it progressed and more coherent in its final form than past scholarship allowed. The way I put it for students is, the Pentateuch was written by one author who was not Moses, or by hundreds of authors, but not by 4.